Hello, everyone, and welcome to this week's IAS Thursday presentation. I'm Brianna Menning, the Programs and Communications Manager at the Institute for Advanced Study. I'm happy to be introducing today's event, which is the first in our Spotlight series for the year. Today's event is, as you can see, Grasping at the Root, Intersectionality and Environmental Justice. I'll be making a few short announcements, and then we're going to begin. The University of Minnesota Twin Cities is located on traditional, ancestral, and contemporary lands of Indigenous people. The university resides on Dakota land ceded in the treaties of 1837 and 1851. The IAS acknowledges this place has a complex and layered history. This land acknowledgement is one of the ways in which we work to educate the campus and community about this land and our relationships with it and each other. The IAS is committed to ongoing efforts to recognize, support, and advocate for American Indian nations and peoples. The University of Minnesota Spotlight Series is a collaborative partnership between the Institute for Advanced Study, Northrop, and the University Honors Program. In this Spotlight Series, we present lectures, panel discussions, exhibits, and other events throughout the academic year around a topic of timely interest. The 2019-20 series focuses on environmental justice and features perspectives from a variety of voices in the field, including academics and practitioners from multiple disciplines. Campus leaders, artists, policymakers, and funders will explore several critical aspects surrounding the intersection of environment and equity. Our next event in this series will be Thursday, October 10th. If you're interested in the breadth of other programming in Northrop, please visit the Northrop website or sign up for their email list. Next week's IAS Thursday will be a conversation between Josephine Lee of the University of Minnesota English and Asian American Studies departments and Sarah Bellamy, the artistic director of the Penumbra Theater, on the shared spaces of yellowface and blackface. Please join us at 3:30 p.m. next Thursday downstairs in the Crosby Seminar Room on the second floor. In addition to the presenting partners today, our presentation is co-sponsored by the Race, Indigeneity, Gender, and Sexuality Studies Initiative, the Institute for Global Studies, the Department of Geography, Environment, and Society, and the Humphrey School of Public Affairs Urban and Regional Planning Area. Students participating in the Nexus experience with honors, please walk to the Nolte Hall Lounge for discussion immediately after the conclusion of the Q&A following today's lecture. Now, finally, please let me introduce today's speaker, Dr. Fayola Jacobs. Dr. Jacobs is an assistant professor in the Urban and Regional Planning area at the Humphrey School of Public Affairs. Prior to her appointment in August of 2019, she was a postdoctoral associate with the CREATE initiative at the university. She completed her PhD in Urban and Regional Sciences at the Texas A&M University and her master's degree in City and Regional Planning at UNC Chapel Hill. Her graduate research focused on interrogating disaster mitigation plans and policies through a Black feminist lens. Before graduate school, she worked for a mental health agency, creating and facilitating anti-oppression workshops on migration, racism, and mental health. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Jacobs.
Hello, everybody. Oh, y'all give such a better response than my class, who happens to be sitting here. I usually have to ask them twice. First of all, let's have a moment to lower our expectations. I cannot be responsible for what Fayola of 2 months ago, who wrote the description for this talk, promised you. I don't know that person, and that person did not know me. So we are going to go on an unplanned journey together, and it will be great. But in the spirit of trying to stay true to what y'all showed up here for, here's the first slide. So where I got the title of my talk from was an Angela Davis quote where she was talking about what it means to be radical, and for her, it was simply grasping at the root. And so during this presentation, I would like to really think about the ways in which we've moved away from the roots of environmental justice and intersectionality, and what the roots can really provide for us if we revisit them. So I was making an agenda. PowerPoint had no design suggestions for this slide. I had no idea what image to put here, so there's no consistent theme to the naming of the sections. Bear with me. And so I will be starting with talking a little bit about home and all the people who call this place home. I will be giving a little bit of an introduction to me and also to what this is and where it came from, this being this lecture. I'm going to go over some of the origins of the environmental justice movement and research, as well as intersectionality as a concept and analytical frame, and really talking about what they can offer disaster and climate change studies and also what they have offered. And then I'll talk a little bit, if we have time, about some of my past work, specifically looking at an intersectional environmental justice approach to the National Flood Insurance Program's community rating system, and then just give an overview of some of the losses that we experience by not grasping at the roots, and talk about some future orientations. So, in terms of home, home is a very important concept to me, and it would be horrible if I did not acknowledge all the people who have called this home and who can no longer call this home. So first of all, as the IAS acknowledged, we are on Dakota land. I really want to acknowledge especially the Dakota and Ojibwe people of Minnesota and those who call this home, those who are struggling to figure out how to still call this home after displacement and genocide, as well as newer folks, such as the African American communities that are really rooted in Minnesota and again have been pushed out and pushed aside and are really struggling to call a place that their ancestors bled and were buried home. I would also like to call out the immigrants, the new immigrants who are calling this home and struggling with the push factors that may have forced them out of previous homes, as well as the pull factors that made them think that this could be a welcoming home. Whether or not that is realistic, we have yet to see. And really acknowledging that those push factors and pull factors are not separate from each other and are both dictated by forces of global capitalism and racial capitalism, along with many, many other systems that force people away from where they call home and where they are rooted. In terms of acknowledgements, I would also like to thank my class for allowing me to move up class by half an hour, coming over to this part of campus at 3:30 instead of staying in Humphrey at 4, and bearing with me for all of the things that they have heard a million times over and over just in the 4 sessions that I have taught so far. And I really always joke to people, well, at least in my women's studies intro class in undergrad, we would always joke that the way you can get extra points is to start with, as a insert identity here person. And I understand the joke, and it's pretty funny. At the same time, I do really believe in positioning myself, the identity, particularly as it pertains to oppression and privileges that we endure that have really shaped how we view the world. And so in the interest of that, I would really like to say that I am a Caribbean Black woman who is living at the intersection of many, many different privileges, structural privileges and structural oppression, sometimes that take place at the same time, and it's very, very confusing. I want to be really upfront, and in my positioning, I know you see a Black person here. Black is not the same as African American, and so many of the struggles that I am talking about are African American struggles rooted in African American civil rights activism that also were reflective of global diasporic understandings, but still there is a certain privilege in not being from here. I would also like to acknowledge I am not currently calling myself an activist. I used to at some point. I am negotiating my re-entry into activism, as well as renegotiating what I feel about policy and practice, being in a school of public affairs, but also not really always thinking through what the practical solutions are. So bear with me especially during the questions and answer period, please. And so I joked with my students that this is the word cloud I see every night when I close my eyes. And really, this is me being constantly rooted in understandings of the systems that got us here. Sure, we have individual choice, but when individuals are making the same kinds of choices, we have to question how much of a choice it is. And that's kind of the background to my general outlook. So, in terms of this, this talk really has come from a few different formations. So I am really interested in the lens of disasters. Let me see if I know how to use this. Is that doing something? Is there a pointer thingy? No? Maybe? Okay, so pretend there's a red dot on that top upper left quadrant, right? Okay, yes. So that is kind of my orientation thinking through disasters. So the quote says by Dr. Hilary Beckles, a chancellor at UWI, the persistent loss of Black life and the dereliction of poor people's materialism in a backward-built environment that was designed for the sole purpose of servicing imperial sugar plantations. So he's speaking about this after the losses to Caribbean nations and territories in with Hurricane Irma and Hurricane Maria, talking about reparations and what they look like. Another striking image in this, in his article, was really talking about the ways that hurricanes often trace the path of the Atlantic slave trade as they come through. And so really thinking about what does it mean that these islands that were centered around slavery and plantation slavery are now being damaged for some of the same reasons that drove that plantation slavery. And so that's something that always haunts me. So another thing that really struck me, I was asked to review an article. The article was dealing a lot with intersectionality. I went through the references, and there was not one Black woman cited, not even Crenshaw. And I was just really, really amazed by the hollowing out of intersectionality to remove all its Blackness. Another article that really struck me was this article by Jill Harrison on the co-option of environmental justice. In this article, she reviews a bunch of projects that were funded by the EPA, both the national office as well as certain offices in California and New York, and really is evaluating the ways in which the calls for applicants for the grants are moving away from what EJ originally intended, and the products coming out of them are really not holding states accountable. Rather, they are just saying, which she acknowledges are important things, community gardens and a lot of individual actions, placing the onus on especially oppressed communities to make a change. And really, environmental justice at its beginning was really thinking about pushing the state to acknowledge the role it played in getting us where we are. And so finally, and this is a metaphor I'm still working on, but this house you see, well, I don't have to give you a direction because it's the only house. This house you see is a house in Durham. And when I was living in North Carolina in Chapel Hill, often going to Durham, you would see all these houses being renovated in all these historically Black neighborhoods. And it was generally young white folks who are liberal, who are cool and hip and lovely people as you get to know them individually, buying these Black houses that Black families could no longer afford to rent, much less own, and rehabbing them. And so when I went into my first one of these houses renovated by one of my great friends, I was just really struck at the ways that the remnants of Blackness were held on to and strategically placed, So I think about the intersectionality and environmental justice as undergoing this gentrification process where the blackness is cool, so you keep the outside of the shotgun house, you keep that look and that aesthetic. You hollow out all the blackness, including the black people that you don't want, and you move in there with all these reminders of what it was, but not really the essence of it or why it was created. And so I've really been thinking through what it means to be hollowing out and gentrifying Black things like intersectionality and environmental justice. So oh, that's a lot darker, I'm sorry. In the interest of talking about origins, EJNet, which is a website dedicated to providing resources for EJ activists and organizations, it says environmental racism is the disproportionate impact of hazards on people of color. Environmental justice is the movement's response to environmental racism. So on this front page of this website, they do a really powerful, great job of really calling out some of the ways that environmental justice has moved away from its original intentions. So the resources speak to environmental justice is not environmental equity. Like, environmental justice is not the EPA definition of environmental justice. Environmental justice is about the discrimination, systemic discrimination that people of color have experienced that results in more environmental bads and less environmental goods. So they are essentially saying that the way that the environmental justice is framed by a lot of agencies and organizations is the equivalent of an all lives matter saying. So you are specifically pointing out people of color face these things, and then environmental justice is all people deserve these things. And so I was really struck by the way that that was framed. And this is a picture from what is often considered as the galvanizing event of the environmental justice movement. How many people are familiar with what happened in Warren County, North Carolina? Okay, so a few, but not half even. So Warren County, North Carolina, in about 1982, after, I'm not going to embarrass myself by trying to pronounce the full name of the chemical, but PCBs. Anybody has a pronunciation? No, okay, we'll go with PCBs. And so PCBs were a known pollutant, a known toxic pollutant that were actually banned from production in the United States in 1978. In the years prior to 1982, the protests, the government trucks started dumping liquids containing PCBs along North Carolina highways. So eventually in 1982, they're like, I guess that's a bad thing. Let's get up this soil that we were polluting and put it in a toxic waste dump in Warren County, North Carolina, one of the blackest, poorest counties at that time in North Carolina, and people were upset. So there were a series of protests in which government officials who were elected by their communities were elected. The churches were very, very involved in this struggle. It was the first time in the US history that people were arrested for objecting to pollution, for objecting to this kind of dump. And so you see the environmental justice movement being born from those protests. It was successful in terms of galvanizing community support and really being a point of building the movement. But at the same time, the dump in Warren County's landfill still happened. And maybe about 10 years later, they were like, oh, when the technology becomes available, then we will definitely decontaminate. And that was not the case. It took a very, very long time for them to decontaminate the site. And so in terms of what past Fayola promised you. She seemed to promise you some kind of lit review of like what environmental justice movements had done, as well as what environmental justice movements were currently doing in both in activism and in research. However, these articles do it a lot better than I could. And I really just want to point to both of these articles as being a really good galvanizing, like, this is where we are moments. Both in, so the Polito article was in 2000, and the Agaman article was in 2014, I believe. I might be getting the year wrong because I can't read it on either this screen or that screen. So I won't do as in-depth a lit review as I would like to, but I would point to a few different things. So in terms of some of the travel, so as we see, it really started, the environmental justice movement really started with toxic pollution and toxic waste. And even though I say Warren County was recognized as the birth of the movement, it was the birth only really in name, because there had been a lot of similar struggles going on. There were a lot of Latino and Chicanx organizers who were organizing specifically around worker safety. There was a lot of organization around pollutants in farm industries, and whereas the traditional environmentalism movement had focused more on their effects on non-human living things, the Chicanx movement was really focused on worker safety, and what about those of us who are working to farm the land and getting exposed to this? There have been movements across, it has traveled across the world, so you're seeing a lot of alliances being built with Global South organizers, as particularly those who use political ecology and racial capitalism as frameworks. So you saw lots of stuff around deforestation, reproductive justice, disasters, and climate justice. And one of the really major areas of contentions with environmental justice academics particularly is some of the methods. So really originally environmental justice, some of the groundbreaking reports that give us a lot of information, such as the United Church of Christ 1992 report, I might be getting the year wrong, they really focused on quantitative methods of mapping. So how do we map where these toxic sites are? How do we map how far they are from communities of color? How do we map all of these things? So you saw really alarming statistics, like 3 out of 5 people of color in the United States at that time were living within close distance of a toxic waste facility. I mean, those were really, really vital information for people to get and really shape some of the ways that we understand environmental justice. But a lot of people have really been thinking about how we push beyond that. So how do we push beyond these quantitative analyses, these spatial analyses that might not confirm what communities know, right? As we saw in Flint, science sometimes takes a long time to catch up to communities' knowledge, and we really cannot just be like, okay, well, the numbers say it doesn't happen, so it doesn't really count. And so really thinking through more qualitative explorations of not just distributive justice, but also procedural justice, as well as recognition-based justice. Like, who is involved in these planning processes? Who is making these decisions? Who is at the table? And that sparked a whole new realm of really pushing for citizen science and local knowledge and participatory mapping processes that could stand on their own, as well as be integrated into and strengthen the already quantitative, spatially mapped things. So moving on a little to environmental justice. To intersectionality. So does anyone know? I am sorry. One of these days I'll learn to stop making sound effects. If my excellent stalking mother has found this link that I did not send her, she'd be like, Fayola, what is wrong with you? And so, who knows who the upper left? Sojourner Truth, famous speech? Ain't I a woman? Listen, I don't usually do that dinner guess. Who could you do dinner with from in the future or whatever? I'm like, I would have dinner with my friends. Like, I don't know what you're talking about. But I would invite Sojourner Truth to my dinner because, Sojourner Truth renamed herself after being born into slavery in 1797. And she's documented as having run away in 1827 after her master did not follow through on his promise to free her in that year. And when she later talked to her master, she said, "I did not run away. I walked away by daylight." Absolute, like, that's a boss move. And so Ain't I a Woman was her famous speech, which was really some of the most groundbreaking thing in the women's movement and the abolition movement. And she says, "Nobody ever helps me into carriages or over mud puddles or gives me any best place. And ain't I a woman? Look at me, look at my arm. I have plowed and planted and gathered into barns, and no man could head me, and ain't I a woman?" And so really bringing out these notions of femininity that were ascribed to the entire female gender were really based in a certain race and a certain class. It was white upper class women who did not have to do work. And so I'm always amazed that we have the rights, fighting for the right to work movement. And I'm like, well, Black women been working all the time. And also when you go out to work, who's going to watch your kids? It's going to be Black women. And so there's this work at both ends that is not really acknowledged or contended with. And so what about upper right? Yes. No, not. But Audre Lorde. I, as a Caribbean descended woman, Audre Lorde has my heart. And really did a lot of fabulous writings. One that she's particularly well known for is her short piece on the master's tools. And so she describes herself as she described herself as a Black lesbian mother warrior poet. And so she speaks about those of us who stand outside the circle of this society's definition of acceptable woman, those of us who are poor, who are lesbians, who are Black, who are older, know that survival is not an academic skill. And this fact is only threatening to those women who still define the master's house as their only source of support. And so that brings us to Kimberly Crenshaw, who coins the term intersectionality, building on this work that a lot of women were doing before Kimberly Crenshaw. And I missed the quote. I knew I had the definition somewhere. So one of the things that she speaks about in talking about her intersectionality really came out of her critical race studies within a legal framework, and she was really contending with the fact that there were these cases that in court that Black women were saying, "This is a result of my race and gender," and judges were throwing it out, saying like, "Yeah, pick one." Because we have race, we have gender, you can't do them both. And so she says, it's not just an additive thing because the intersectional experience is greater than the sum of racism and sexism. And aside from being greater than the sum of racism and sexism, it's an entirely different beast of its own making. And so really she encouraged us to think through not just identities, but really the interlocking systems of oppression that make these experiences very different. And so these are also really good reviews of where intersectionality is at. There's a lot of discussion around the origins of intersectionality, acknowledging Black women's role in creating this theory. as well as some of the methodological challenges. I spent a lot of time deep in the quantitative intersectionality literature. So do quantitative methodologies, particularly of large data sets, really have a place in this field that is really, really committed to unpacking some of the harmful things that statistics have done and r- some of the made upness of this supposedly objective way of quantifying and qualifying people's experiences. And so intersectionality really originally started out in those court cases around intimate partner violence. It has moved to things like health equity, HIV, AIDS, transphobia, bullying and discrimination, as well as disasters and climate change. And as I've mentioned, there have been a lot of different approaches to intersectionality, some which that you are really typical of the women's studies field, and some of them are a little bit different. So thinking through what does an intersectional policy analysis look like? Like, what could we do? Like, how do we read climate change plans from an intersection lens? And so, speaking both about environmental justice and intersectionality and how they have approached climate change and disasters, which is really my focus, so environmental justice has taken up climate change and disasters a little bit more, well, significantly more than intersectionality has, particularly through a lot of work being done by Dr. Robert Bullard, who is often referred to as the father of environmental justice, and Beverly Wright and their institutes that focus on environmental justice in the U.S. South. And so this book, Race, Place, and Environmental Justice after Hurricane Katrina, really represents a really turning point in turning the environmental justice lens towards issues of so-called natural disasters. And Hurricane Katrina was really a galvanizing point for, while there had been studies around race, class, and gender before that, Hurricane Katrina really was the milkshake that brought all the boys to the yard. So a lot more people were really more involved with it. And then also there's this really great article called Racialized Disaster Patriarchy, where Dr. Love takes up Naomi Klein's concept of disaster capitalism and adds an explicitly intersectional angle to it, thinking through the systems of racism, classism, and sexism. So one of the things that I think is key to what both intersectionality and environmental justice offer us that a lot of traditional disaster studies that often bring in factors of race, class, and gender do not do is, as Polito says, speaking of the dangers of what's happening to environmental justice, but could be applied to intersectionality, it's by reducing racism to a hostile discriminatory act. Many researchers, with the notable exception of Bullard, missed the role of structural and hegemonic forms of racism in contributing to such inequalities. And so I'm going to mention this a couple times, but I think what is really the danger, another danger that even goes greater, takes up a greater space in disaster studies than thinking individual racism is the only kind of racism, is the danger in not even thinking about racism at all, thinking about race. So talking about things caused by racism and speaking about them as though they were caused by race. And so with that, this quote also really refers to, Polito goes on to talk about the problems of problem identification and solutions. So problem identification is a big part of what kinds of solutions that you're going to come up with. And so if we're identifying the wrong problem, if we're identifying the wrong root or not trying to get to the root at all, our solutions are not going to get to the root either. And so I want to do a pseudo tangent on vulnerability. So I did So I did my research in urban planning under a lot of really wonderful researchers who use the lens of social vulnerability. And social vulnerability is a lens used by a lot of social science and interdisciplinary disaster studies. And it's really thinking about the ways in which one's race, class, gender, ability, all these things make one more vulnerable to hazards. I got into many conversations with my advisors about why I thought that social vulnerability was insufficient. And one of the places I was going to really build my understandings as someone who worked in the past and was very interested in issues of discrimination against people with mental health issues, discrimination against people with disabilities. Disability studies is such a powerful place that I think so many disciplines could learn from. Critical disability justice offers so many lessons for so many different movements, and people are not really invested in it, even though one of the things that a lot of disability studies activists say is that all of us who are able-bodied, the correct term would probably be temporarily able-bodied. So really thinking through the fact that disabilities are going to affect a lot of us if we are blessed to live long. And so it is a space that we should be looking to regardless of whether or not we care about other people. Like if we only care about ourselves, that's a place we need to look to. And so really challenging some of the things about vulnerability. So in order to analyze vulnerability as part of wider societal patterns, we need to identify the deep-rooted and underlying causes of disaster vulnerability and the mechanisms and dynamic processes that transform these into insecure conditions. And so in this article, I really like by Burkhardt, where I don't think they were specifically talking about disasters in this moment, but challenges to the notion of vulnerability rarely occur because those so labeled are seen as requiring care and protection. Woe to those who might suggest that marginalized groups of people might actually desire and do better with less care, greater autonomy, and fewer vulnerable designations. And so in the thing that the injustice done to people with disabilities or disabled people is also an injustice that's done with anybody who is paternalized. And it's like, we know what's best for you, said by the powerful group, and by making someone vulnerable and making you the source of knowledge, you are all immediately invalidating everything that they say. Everything comes with a caveat. And it's like a very, very impressive power tactic. It's a very, very impressive strategy to delegitimize people who disagree. So it is 4:11 now. I had imagined going through a little of what I did for my graduate research. I'm going to try to shorten this in a way that does make sense. So I was really interested in disaster mitigation. A lot of people think my focus is recovery. I understand why a lot more people are in recovery, but as a planner who came under some of the best academic minds in hazard mitigation, I followed in their footsteps, and I was really thinking about what are we doing about long-term solutions to stop these things from happening. So I spent a lot of time looking at a lot of horrible hazard mitigation plans. And I decided to look at the National Flood Insurance Program. I chose the National Flood Insurance Program because I was a young Black scholar who was looking to get a job at some point and using Black feminism and environmental justice, and it was a very strategic move that I need to do something quantitative to tell these people, like, I can talk your language, I just don't want to necessarily speak it all the time. And so I did a quantitative dissertation. And so I turned to the National Flood Insurance Program. I was always interested to see which kinds of communities are able to participate in this program. And I specifically was looking at the program's community rating system. So most communities are in the National Flood Insurance Program. requires a municipality or county to implement a like baseline number of hazard mitigation policies. So you'd jump through some easier hoops than the CRS at least, and you get access to flood insurance, to discounted flood insurance, which very few insurance companies would offer because it's just really too expensive. The risk is too great. So I looked at the community rating system, which is a substantially smaller group of communities. So whereas the National Flood Insurance Program is about the National Flood Insurance Program is 22,000 jurisdictions. The community rating system is about 1,400. And so these are more stringent requirements for getting into the community rating system, but the payoff is also big. So not only do you get access to this flood insurance, but if you're living in the 100-year floodplain in one of these communities that has signed up, living or your business is there, you get access to discounted flood insurance. So it can range from getting a 5% discount if you are a class 9 to getting a 45% discount if you're a class 1. As a point of interest, the only class 1 community the last I checked, which would have been 2 years ago, and I would be very surprised if it changed since then, was Roseville, California. They have an extensive hazard mitigation plans, which includes a wide range of community engagement efforts, as well as some very comprehensive mitigation actions, including goat grazing. So yeah, they're doing a lot, they're doing well, cool, 45% discount. But I'm like, which kinds of communities, which kinds of jurisdictions can afford the time and effort to put into these mitigation plans and mitigation planning in general? And also, what makes people decide, what makes a community, what makes a planner decide whether or not to take on this thing? Like, which communities matter to these planners? And so there are a series of actions you can complete. There's the Series 300, which is public information, posting signs. This property used to be flooded. This property is prone to flooding. There's the Series 400, which is mapping and regulations, which is a little bit more involved, but not as involved as the 500 and 600. The 500 and 600 activities tend to be activities that require a lot of technical expertise, a lot of human resources, and are things like, to do with bigger, more structural engineering projects such as building dams and levees and upkeeping the maintenance of that. And buying out properties, that's also a big part of getting some of those points under the Series 500 and 600. And so, not to bore y'all with math, but the CRS, so basically this was my theory, that the number of points or the discount, or even whether you participate or not in CRS, would be a function of your hazard exposure, aka if you have more land in the floodplain, you would be more likely to take the actions to join the CRS. The community capacity, and so there's some overlap with the community demographics as well as some collinearity issues. I'm happy to talk about that more with people who really want to talk about it. But their community capacity, I was really looking at the median income in the community, looking at the size of the community, assuming that a larger jurisdiction would have more resources to do something like this, as well as whether or not they had a comprehensive plan, etc. And so the community demographics, I was specifically, because I was trying to apply like very bare bones intersectionality theory, as well as environmental justice theory. I'm like, let me just be basic and to pick people of color, female-headed households, and percentage in poverty, which I pulled off the census and ACS statistics. Another reason that I was not doing anything like factor analysis of more complicated variables was because the data set was so small, and I was looking at Gulf communities in the Gulf states and Gulf and Atlantic states. So I needed something that had a lot of information, and these statistics tended to in the census and ACS. A lot more information, but the basic premise of this, I developed 4 models. The rational disaster management was more for the traditional planners who were like, we don't care about race. We think that the only thing that matters is these things. And so thinking through, if a rational disaster planner were modeling the relationship I showed before, what would their theory be about how that worked? And so for them, this mythical planner, I assumed that they would think that CRS was based just on hazard exposure and community capacity. For the socially vulnerable planner, they had the hazard exposure and the community capacity, but this time they were like, race, class, and gender. So let's think about the people of color in the jurisdiction, the female-headed households in the jurisdiction, the number of families in poverty in the jurisdiction. If these things are higher, this will mean that we are less able to implement the CRS because those people are really reducing our capacity. And so that's kind of the vulnerable designation take on it. And so for the environmental justice, for the sake of sticking to a traditional theory, environmental justice has typically dealt a lot with race and to some extent class, and so I was really interested in the environmental justice person, not just taking the community demographics a step further. So they're not just saying, oh, if we have more Black people in the floodplains, if we have more Black people in the jurisdiction, our community is going to be weaker. What this theory is actually saying is it's not about having more Black people in the jurisdiction, it's about having more people of color and people living in poverty in the floodplains. And so why that changes the analysis, or why that theory is different, is it really means that planners, this is taking the sense that there are planners out there who are saying, yeah, our floodplains, we have floodplains, but it's mostly Black and poor people living in the floodplains. So we're going to skip this whole mitigation policy thing. They don't matter. Let's not plan for them, or let's not plan to protect them. This might seem like a wild assumption to some people, but I just want to keep in mind that as I shared with my class, last class, there was a documentary that came out maybe a week ago on the Flint water crisis, in which somebody is saying that a high-ranking official within the Flint government was told that there was something wrong with the water and that something needed to be done or else people were going to die. And he said, well, they have to die of something. So the intersectional environmental justice, again, it takes that same theory of we care less about protecting our floodplains if there are a bunch of people of color and poor people in the floodplains, and instead it's looking at the intersections of those communities. So it's looking at percentage of female-headed household, percentage of female of color-headed households, percentage of female-headed households in poverty, percentage of people of color in poverty. Hopefully you get my abbreviation key. And so I was worried that it would just be too much on one slide. Y'all bared with me. It's the same slide, just crushed into 4. All right. So these were my results. I'm not going to be obnoxious and put all the numbers up there. But rational planning is real. So all of the highlighted things or things in color are things that showed up as significant. And there's a lot of information here and a lot to unpack, but all of that, is that green? Y'all, we call that green? Okay. All of that green, yes, rational planning matters for a lot. So I was modeling the discount, the total points, and the number of points by each category. So rational planning counts, we acknowledge that. Nobody is ever saying the physical environment doesn't matter. Social vulnerability, again, I had to this was a very difficult analysis for lots of various reasons. But the social vulnerability, there are just 2 things that came out, and they weren't, you won't see it here because the numbers aren't here, but they weren't very strong negatives. Like they were strong they were strong enough p-values, but they weren't strong in terms of their magnitude. But what I was really surprised, because I really thought it was possible the numbers weren't going to support it, but the numbers supported that environmental justice theory had more going on than the social vulnerability theory. It was a more powerful model, and the intersectional environmental justice model was even more powerful. In terms of the variables that were popping up as significant. And keep in mind, these are variables. So looking at that first, at the environmental justice model, it looks like only people of color matter in certain circumstances. And then we're seeing here that when you add female-headed households, it's showing up as significant within female-headed households across a number of different smaller communities. And so we would have missed that completely if we were just looking at social vulnerability. And so that was a very quick and dirty overview of what using an intersectional environmental justice analysis can do for a quantitative dissertation, for a quantitative analysis. But I would argue so much of their power is is more in qualitative discourses, and it really makes clear some things that we could have been missing if we weren't asking the right questions. Again, those are just the 4 things I squeezed on the chart. And so there was a lot of conversation about the NFIP and whether or not it would be renewed. And I just want to highlight here that, again, rational planning is occurring, and we would have missed things if we weren't looking at people of color specifically in the floodplain and people of color in combination with other variables. So, as an aside, I have to do this because too many students in my class are here. At last class, I kind of joked that only people that I find it really funny when people quote themselves in their articles, and it's obvious that they have a lot to say. Well, I give myself 10 points for self-awareness because I have a lot to say, and I'm quoting myself. Okay, so this is At Risk. It is praised as the book on social vulnerability, the book that really helped us think through a lot of the forces that shape vulnerability. Blakey Wisner and all did an excellent job of introducing new analyses to the disaster field and really thinking through some things. One place where I really think that they missed the mark, well, there were a lot of places I think that they missed the mark, but one place where they missed the mark, there was a conversation in a post-disaster field, and it was saying, incidents of domestic violence have come up. And so have come up a lot more in the post-disaster thing, and this happens a lot. And so what they were really saying was, it's like things are tense, the male anxieties are being acted out, they're acting them out on these, on their partners, on their women partners, in this situation of stress. And I was like, you had such a great opportunity there to not only talk about the ways that, yes, domestic violence goes up after these extreme events, but also to talk about it's a problem that it existed in the first place. And so what disasters for me do, they don't create new things. They brush away the dust, they wash away the facades, and they're like, you try to put a pretty face on it, but these are the ways you're messing everything up, right? And so for me, it's really just a missed lesson when we look at racism and call it race, when we look at sexism and call it gender, like when we look at all of these things and miss the structural systems that are producing these things, and it really reduces our opportunities for imagining differently. So I didn't really think about the fact that this was going to be broadcast. I only thought about it this morning. This is not great research. Don't tell anybody, y'all are watching this too, don't tell anybody I said this. But one of my favorite things to do is to do a quick and dirty literature search and to see what kinds of articles are cut out. Again, the options that PowerPoint design gave me for this were awful, so y'all just have to live with the juvenile way, not even juvenile, maybe, I don't know what it is, the non-graphic oriented way my mind works and pretend that this is a pretty slide, okay? So what we're seeing here, I went to the University of Minnesota's library website, I typed in these terms, and I was like, how many articles are going to come up for something like this? So environmental justice as a phrase, so I want you to, before I start, the equals is the number of articles that came up. I suppressed it for articles that were in English, as well as articles that were available fully online, so that I could arguably say that they searched the text of the articles, as well as articles that were in peer reviewed. And so when I searched for environmental justice, I got 21,298 articles. The 3,094 in the parentheses is the number of articles with environmental justice in the title. Then we have environmental justice and race. It cut down to almost, I can't do quick calculation, so let's just say it cut down by a lot of percent. And so we're going from 21,000 articles to 8,000 articles. When you add racism, it's 4,000 articles. About half. You see that quick math there? So my mind is just blown. Like, how are you talking about environmental justice and there is no mention of racism or even race anywhere in your article? And I was like, okay, maybe they just announced it, but maybe they just mentioned it in passing, but those in the title, you have 3,000 articles with environmental justice in the title, you add race and it's 897. What were those other 2,000 articles talking about? I am so confused. And so, I mean, you see the same pattern in disasters when you add the same term. So again, it's just environmental justice that I'm keeping in the title for those grayed out figures in parentheses. But routinely, it's cutting by half when you add race and another half when you add racism. So what are we talking about here? Like, how are you comfortable saying environmental justice in your title if there's no mention of racism? If there's no mention of race. I just don't. Sure, there are a few articles that maybe they said African American, maybe they said systemic discrimination against African American people or against Black people, but I highly doubt that that was the case for 13,000 articles. See that quick math? Intersectionality, I just did the really abbreviated results, and so also acknowledging that intersectionality might be used in not the sense that we use intersectionality in, and so I was like, if it has intersectionality and feminism, and that's 7,000 articles. When you add racism, it cuts down to 3,000 articles. When you add Crenshaw, it cuts down to 2,000 articles. So how are you have intersectionality in the title and feminism somewhere and Crenshaw is nowhere to be found and racism is nowhere to be found? So it's just really showing like what people are talking about. They're using these terms without really contending with the point of these terms. So stop using it. Anyway, so in terms of future thinking, again, I started this by saying I struggle with policy, I struggle with action, and I've been spending especially in the past few years, I've just been living a lot in my head. But the thing is, there are people who have been thinking about policy for so much longer than I am. There are people who have been thinking and contending with strategy for so much longer than I have been. And so, I pointed out I referenced those articles before, and here I really do want to give a shout out to two books. The Pedagogy of the Oppressed, a very, very old book that we wished weren't applicable today, but it is. Thank you, Freya, for your work. As well as How to Be an Anti-Racist, which both talks about the systems and individual choices that people can make as they're committing to anti-racist work. And I have to, all of my students know about my love of Afro diasporic speculative fiction, particularly Octavia Butler. When you're reading Parable of the Sower, you're like, did you have a time machine? Because I don't understand how you knew all of this was coming. And so for me, that points as I tell my students, and I promised them I would be integrating this more into the class, and I really hope that my syllabus changes a little bit. But really, if we're talking about people being systemically disadvantaged, and some of that plays out in terms of people of color not being up here in like honestly, the number of people who are really excited about me being at the University of Minnesota is really indicates to me how few Black women are here, right? And so if we're saying that Black women know things, and we're saying that Black women have been stopped from entering the classroom, how are we going to have an entire class that is about structural oppression when it's just all academic articles? So I'm really big on different ways of knowing. Some of the ways I came to know myself and understand systems best is through fictive writing. And so really, what does it look like to draw on different sources of knowledge? What does it look like to really think through different ways of listening? And so listening also with that always in your mind that there are historically rooted problems, that things are often with systems, many of the wicked problems that we're addressing. And one of the things I also really struggle with, like obviously those kinds of solutions are longer term, and obviously they take a while and require patience, and people are dying and hurting now. But I'm really concerned about rushing to quick fixes to make things better for a few people, when the reality is making those things better in those ways fools us into thinking the system is working or can accommodate us, and also fools us into being comfortable for a little bit longer with a system that needs to be dismantled. And so I really don't know what the future looks like. I am trying to engage more with people who are living at the intersections of so many systemic oppressions and are thinking through the realities of those. So I told people my Instagram is now very carefully curated. There are like Black and Indigenous, disabled people, queer folks, gender non-binary, because the reality is not to fetishize people, but I, I am not going to lead the radical movement with a PhD coming from a middle class background. I don't have that kind of lived experience and the kinds of knowledge about the possibilities that do work, right? Or can work or could work. And so I'm really interested in taking leadership from people who are living the brunt of these systems and really articulating some very powerful alternatives for existence. And so I'm really grateful for being allowed this place to speak here. But I mean, really my hope is that in 20 years I won't have a space to speak here because it's going to be someone who has lived experience with different kinds of oppression who can take my place in speaking about all of these horrible and difficult things and all of the possibilities for something different. Thank you for bearing with me on the journey that was very different from what I promised you, past Fayola promised you. And yeah. Sure. My class knows I'm very comfortable with awkward silence, so yes. So for those of you who couldn't hear, the person asked, when did environmental justice really start shifting away from these kinds of definitions of racism? I would argue in some ways from the beginning. So you saw, let me pull up those exact dates. So the the Warren County the Warren County protests were in 1982, and then we saw in the GAO Government Accountability Office produced a report, I think, in 1983, and I think in the late 80s was when the EPA started their environmental justice office. It was called something different then. And in 92, President Clinton made a statement saying that all federal agencies had to consider environmental justice. I do not know much about the early projects that were funded by the EPA or the initiatives of the federal government, but I would guess that in 92 there wasn't a radical EJ organizers being funded by that office. And so some people are making the argument that housing it under the EPA and really federal agencies taking on environmental justice in the ways that they have has always been a strategic move to co-opt and subvert movements. But granted, there are a lot of great people working at APA with really good intentions who are really trying to do things there, but I don't know that they would have ever been, the organization would have ever been on board. Yes. Okay. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay, so for those of you who couldn't hear, the question was around the Upper Harbor Terminal in North Minneapolis and what my general take on the gentrification and process going on there is. Um, I don't know what large-scale ethical development can look like. I don't know what large-scale ethical development that is public-private partnerships can look like. I do not know the possibilities. I know that in the past, a lot of similar developments have promised to stave off gentrification and have not really been committed to it. I would say that Minneapolis, at least, is the city. Certain folks are talking the talk of really being interested in making sure that longtime Northsiders can afford to stay. One thing I will say is North Minneapolis is like there are so many people really rooted in the community who are really, really committed to shaping something different and are making it clear that they're not anti or some have said that they're not anti-development, they're not anti the Upper Harbor Terminal. They just want to make sure it's something that is reflective of community co-development. And so I just keep listening to them. The co-creation team of the Upper Harbor Terminal is taking a lot of leadership in terms of that. There's Project Sweetie Pie and Environmental Justice Coordinating Council and longtime activists like Roxanne O'Brien who are really, really fighting up there. And I'm just whatever they say needs to happen, I'm okay saying that's what needs to happen. Yes.
So you don't know what large-scale ethical development looks like. What are small-scale ethical developments that could maybe all happen in conjunction to make a larger thing? Or just what are some examples of what would be ethical development?
So the question was if I don't know what large-scale ethical development looks like, what does small-scale ethical development look like? I kind of want to say, you're asking present Fayola about something past Fayola said, even if it was 2 minutes in the past. And we don't do that. But I will really reflect on the fact that, yes, I have, for the most part, stayed away from small-scale small development on a whole. But what I will say is that I think that there's a lot of leadership happening with land trusts. I think there's a lot of leadership happening with community cooperative developments. New Rules in North Minneapolis seems to be a very, very community-led collaboration of both developing the New Rules space, which is a gorgeous space, by the way, as well as buying properties in North Minneapolis that communities and the cooperative have said they would be interested in developing into XYZ. And so I am very, very invested in people who are rooted in places, leading a lot of what that development looks like and looking towards cooperative models and iterative things. Like, I don't think that you can plan a 50-acre development and know exactly what it needs to look like, but it will constantly be conversations, constantly be iterations, and hopefully led by a less hierarchical community development cooperative or organization. Yeah.
See, that seems, that can be large scale, but it's like slow scale.
Yes. Yes, it can, as you said, it can be large scale but slow scale. There's that proverb people say, I mean, people say African proverb, and I kind of roll my eyes because I'm like, what's this Africa you speak of? But so I don't know where exactly it comes from or if it even comes from the continent. But it's like, if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. And so really just being committed to that idea of like, it's going to take a long time. It's going to take some very heated discussions with people with very varying opinions to try to come to some consensus, but that's the way we have to commit to.
I'm someone else who also spent some time in North Carolina, and I'm interested in if you have experienced either personally or in your research regional differences about people's willingness to talk about racism and to talk about feminism in the context of environmental justice, or if your experiences in kind of the two places have been the same.
Okay. I love the U.S. South. It reminds me a lot of the Caribbean. I remember when, years upon years ago, when everybody was excited for a certain U.S. president's election, my uncle was very wary. He said, "I like my devil to look like a devil." And I really take that to heart in a lot of ways. Like, I think that I come from very abrupt and honest communities who give you and varied people, but there are a lot of people who will give you their opinion, whether you ask for it or not, whether it's nice or not, and that the South, in the U.S. South, I very much know where I stand with people. And to give an example, in my class I taught at Texas A&M for 7 semesters. And it was a lot of rural white folk from communities in Texas. And I've had on at least 3 or 4 occasions a student in my office hours be like, "I've actually never spoken to a Black person before you." And for me, that's a much better starting point, a much more honest starting point than the starting points I've started with people in Toronto, where I lived for a long time, and people to some extent so far in Minneapolis, who it is like, there's a PC language, there's a political correctness that is hiding a lot of other issues, right? Like, how can I have anti-Black ideas because I was raised in a system of anti-Blackness. How could I not expect other people to, right? And that's okay, but we need to know where we're at so we can move from there. And I would say that there is a veneer of PC-ness that stops us from getting to how people really feel. But at the same time, I will say it makes things a lot more comfortable in everyday environments sometimes. So it's like, oh, okay, cool, like you're smiling, you don't have a problem, cool. But in terms of radical opportunities for radical change, I don't know that it's much better. Yeah.
When you were performing your analysis, this is a boring question, but what were your alpha values, and did you look at the relationships between any of your contributing factors?
So you're talking about using the multi-correlate for the flood. So there were high. I would have to go back. I haven't run the analyses in 2 years, but I would say that there was especially high collinearity between some of the community capacity variables, especially around income, as well as obviously the community demographics variables such as poverty and to some extent people of color, but it didn't rise above, I've forgotten what the usual standard rule of thumb cutoff point is, but it didn't rise to that in terms of me having to drop a variable or being super worried about the p-values being right, the standard errors being right. But I can, if you want to talk geeky math stuff, give me a day to look it over and then we can talk. Send me an email and I will tell you the exact values. Yes.
So this is really
Oh,
asking
sorry.
you to be purely futuristic and talk a little bit about the issue of displacement. I mean, with thinking about flooding, with thinking about sort of permanent toxic contamination and stuff. How are you seeing communities preparing and thinking about their complete displacement from home?
Okay, so the question was thinking about what are my thoughts about displacement and communities facing a lot of these environmental hazards. So there are lots of different approaches communities have used. So the one that stands out to me that I don't know how successful it is right now is the Maldives. When the Maldives realized that it was very clear that they are losing land by the minute. Their first democratically elected president really did a lot of work at, was it the UN Forum on Climate Change? There was some international conference on climate change that he really went and was hounding larger governments like, you have to commit to reducing this. You have to commit to doing differently. You have to. He ended up not being entirely successful, but there was some modicum of success there in that strategy. So I think a lot of nations are really, really contending with going through these international governing bodies to advocate for themselves, which is a remarkable thing to do when you consider how much small nations have to lose on those kinds of scenes. And the threats of losing IMF funding, World Bank grants, or even just, a private nation that is over investing in them and just really using that investment to try and get them to vote the ways that they need them to vote. I think that other communities, again, on a smaller scale, are just really thinking about longer term adaptions. Longer term, like, okay, this is the life that we're going to live. Okay, these things are changing, and so we have to set up things. So in the Caribbean, there are a few different organizations that are working with fisher people as well as with farmers, because things aren't dependable anymore, I love mangoes, and so it is a definite treat when I go home and there is a mango in the tree in April. I am not supposed to be seeing a mango in my tree till July. I am happy to be eating it, but I know that means something is wrong, something is off and out of balance. And so I think a lot of people are returning to sources of ancestral knowledge as well as like just sitting down with elders like, you had drought sometimes, what y'all did? Like, so what are some of the old ways? And there's like really not just with food production, but with everything. Like there's just, especially I've been aware of it in Afro-diasporic communities, there's just been a push to return to ancestral and old ways, that some of which are lost forever through colonization and genocide, but really thinking through not that we've experienced this kind of climate change before, but things have changed before. There have been exceptionally wet years, exceptionally dry years, and how did we deal with them then? And what are the ways we can deal with them now on small scales?
Yes, I was going to ask, as you've set up your new research position here in Minneapolis, what topics around intersectionality and planning are most exciting to you, or do you think are the most pressing in the Minneapolis or Minnesota context?
So the question was, now that I've started in Minnesota, what are the topics that are most pressing or concerning to me in this context? So I will tell you, I'm still thinking through that. As you know, with Create, I was really working a lot on green gentrification issues around Minneapolis, and thinking through that. And I haven't really gone back to integrate like what is my past vision of my research, which I really envisioned and still intend on embarking upon a project that's really connecting some of the community-led efforts by African diasporic populations, particularly the U.S. coastal communities as well as communities in the Caribbean. Just really thinking through what does it mean to understand that we're all connected by these legacies, and using that connection to understand problems and come up with solutions. And I think that through my experience with Create, I was really surprised, but I shouldn't have been, by the ways that communities in the US are so disconnected from each other too, that are fighting some of the same battles. I mean, I think of the connections in the Caribbean as being so hard because you have to have a boat or a plane, and those modes of transportation tend to be really expensive, and so there's so much blocking it. And so for me, it was like, you can drive places, plane travel is cheap, like the internet works most of the time, depending on where you are, And so really thinking that there was the infrastructure here for a lot of cross-community collaborations. But as we saw, like the projects that we were working on in Atlanta could learn so much from some of the work that's being done by some of the organizers here in Minneapolis and vice versa. And so I think in the end, it will be really like, I don't have all the knowledge, but there are communities elsewhere that are fighting similar battles, and really making that connections and those networks to make sure people can learn from each other in terms of strategies. One last question. Oh, I think this person behind you had their hand up first. Yes.
What are your thoughts on the current youth-led climate movement?
Thank you. So, what are my thoughts on the youth-led climate movement? In addition to people I should listen to, I should listen to young people. I actually had notes in my acknowledgement slide from home to mention the climate youth strikes, and so I think that they are great, and I think that even I've been settled into my old ladiness for a really, really long time. I've been calling myself old since I was 18, and I'm realizing now I actually am no longer a youth at 32, and so it's really shocking that nobody's like, no, you're not. You're a youth too. I'm like, Nobody does that anymore, so I am officially old, which is great. And part of my job as a seasoned elder is to really listen to the voice of the youth. And so I'm really, really excited with the organizing that youth are doing across the nation. And it seems like a lot of youth movements are really not like struggling with the intersectionality of issues in the ways that some previous popular movements were not. And so everybody should skip class and go to the climate youth strikes on Friday. Oh, shoot, I keep forgetting people are watching. That I do. So, yeah. But thank you all so much for being with me and joining me on this journey. I really hope that if y'all have more questions, you'll reach out to me. I'm very easy to find. I think if you Google Fayola and Minnesota, I will be the only one who comes up. But yeah, thank you so much.